The symphony of wailing sirens ripped through the tranquil pre-dawn hush of Dubai's prestigious Emirates Hills, shattering its carefully curated serenity. Red and blue lights danced across the marble facades of multi-million-dollar villas, casting eerie shadows that flickered like ghosts of secrets long buried. Emergency vehicles swarmed around Villa 42, a sprawling six-bedroom mansion perched regally by the golf course, a hallmark of opulence. But behind the glistening walls of wealth, something far darker lurked. Inside, chaos met a chilling calm. In his home office, James Mitchell, 45, a towering figure in international banking, lay lifeless, his once commanding presence reduced to a bloodied, crumpled silence. Meanwhile, in the living room, Sarah Mitchell sat composed, almost serene. Draped in her silk designer nightgown, her hands rested delicately on her lap as though she were merely awaiting a morning cup of tea, not the questions of the authorities now storming her home. By sunrise, the story began its transformation into the scandal of the year. British expatriate wife murders banking executive husband in Dubai mansion. The headlines screamed in bold, tantalizing letters. But headlines barely scratched the surface of what was to come. In the days and weeks ahead, the polished facade of the Mitchells' picture-perfect life would crumble, revealing a labyrinth of lies, betrayal, and a double life that stretched across continents. The unraveling was as meticulous as the life Sarah and James had so painstakingly curated for social media, envy-inducing vacations, glittering galas, and snapshots of domestic bliss in their gilded bubble of privilege. But behind the filters and hashtags lay a marriage haunted by shadows, a truth darker than the gleaming marble floors of Villa 42. Before Sarah Mitchell became a name whispered in scandal and speculation, she was Sarah Walker, born in 1985 in London's leafy Hampstead neighborhood. The daughter of a dedicated secondary school teacher and a reserved librarian, Sarah was a study in contradictions, modest origins paired with an insatiable ambition. Even as a child, she displayed an intelligence and drive that set her apart. Teachers at her prestigious all-girls academy often remarked on her uncanny ability to charm and outwit her peers, a skill that would serve her well in the world she was determined to conquer. But Sarah's ascent wasn't without cost. Beneath her polished demeanor lay a complexity few could decipher. From Hampstead to Dubai, from a modest flat to a sprawling mansion, Sarah's journey was marked by a singular focus: escape. Escape from the ordinariness of her upbringing, escape from the limits placed upon her by society, and ultimately, escape from the very life she fought so hard to create. And now, with her husband dead, her hands clean, and her heart seemingly untouched, Sarah's story was just beginning to unravel. The perfect life she projected had been a carefully constructed performance. But who was Sarah Mitchell beneath the designer labels and the curated smiles? A devoted wife caught in an unthinkable tragedy? Or a master manipulator orchestrating her freedom from a gilded cage? As investigators began to piece together the shattered remains of James Mitchell's life and death, the picture grew murkier. Secrets lurked in the corners of their palatial home, in the hushed phone calls, the encrypted emails, and the shadowy figures who moved in the periphery of their glamorous world. This wasn't just a murder. This was a story of ambition and deceit, of a woman who refused to play by the rules society set for her. It was the story of Sarah Mitchell, the woman at the center of a scandal that would grip 2 continents and leave no stone unturned in its wake. Sarah Mitchell's formative years were marked by brilliance and determination. At North London Collegiate School, her teachers often marveled at her ability to dominate both academically and socially, an uncommon blend of sharp intellect and magnetic charm. Sarah was the kind of girl who could ace a calculus exam in the morning and lead a debate competition in the afternoon, recalled a former mentor. This unique combination would become her most potent weapon in the high-stakes world of international finance. Love captivating stories like this one? Don't miss out on more thrilling content. Hit the subscribe button now and stay updated with the most engaging narratives, twists, and turns. Like, share, and join the conversation below. Your next favorite story is just a click away. After graduating with first-class honors from the London School of Economics, Sarah wasted no time climbing the corporate ladder. By her mid-20s, she had already carved a name for herself at Goldman Sachs, dazzling her colleagues with her ability to dissect complex financial models and close multi-million-dollar deals. To her peers, she seemed untouchable, a woman who carried the weight of immense responsibilities with effortless grace. "She was like a force of nature," said Maria Torres, a former colleague. Sarah could spend 12 hours in the trenches working on a deal and still walk into a client dinner looking like she'd just stepped out of a fashion shoot. Her reputation as a powerhouse grew with each success, drawing admiration and envy in equal measure. It was during the 2012 Global Financial Summit in Singapore that fate intervened. James Mitchell, a distinguished senior executive at HSBC's International Division, was on a panel discussing emerging markets when he caught Sarah's eye. His prematurely gray hair and commanding presence exuded a confidence that was hard to ignore. Across the room, their eyes locked in a moment that would alter the course of their lives. David Chen, seated next to Sarah during the panel, later recalled, "You could feel the electricity between them. It was like watching a scene from a romantic drama unfold in real life." That evening, at a networking event, James approached her. What began as a discussion on market volatility and Asian economies quickly spiraled into something far more personal. The conversation stretched into the early hours, with venue staff stacking chairs around them as they remained engrossed in each other. Their romance unfolded at a dizzying pace. Weekend getaways to Paris, candlelit dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants, and private escapes to the Maldives filled their courtship. When James proposed just 6 months later aboard a private yacht in the Mediterranean, presenting Sarah with a flawless 5-carat diamond ring, it seemed like the climax of a fairy tale. The wedding was nothing short of a spectacle. Held at Dubai's iconic Burj Al Arab, the lavish affair featured 200 hand-picked guests flown in from across the globe. Sarah dazzled in a custom-made Vera Wang gown, while James stood tall in a tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. The society pages couldn't get enough of their union, dubbing them the golden couple of the Emirates. Settling into life in Dubai, the Mitchells seemed to have it all. James's role as regional director for HSBC's private banking division afforded them unparalleled wealth and prestige. Their $12 million villa in the Emirates Hills, with its panoramic views of the golf course, became the backdrop for exclusive dinner parties, attended by Dubai's elite. Sarah, who had seamlessly transitioned to Goldman Sachs's Dubai office, quickly became a fixture in the city's social circles, earning admiration for her poise and elegance. Their Instagram profiles chronicled a life of envy-inducing perfection, glamorous galas at the Armani Hotel, desert safaris in their Range Rover, and sun-soaked holidays in the Seychelles. They were always laughing, always touching, like newlyweds even after years of marriage. Rebecca Henderson, a close friend of Sarah's, gushed. They were the kind of couple everyone wanted to be. But behind the glittering facade, cracks were beginning to form. For all their success and happiness, one dream eluded them, the dream of parenthood. After 3 years of marriage, they began IVF treatments at one of Dubai's top fertility clinics. The process, fraught with hope and heartbreak, took its toll. "It was the only time I ever saw Sarah look vulnerable," Rebecca admitted. She was usually so composed, but this broke something in her. Despite their brave faces and determined spirits, whispers began to circulate among their friends. James appeared increasingly distracted, throwing himself into his work. Sarah, once the life of every gathering, grew more reserved. For the first time, the perfect couple showed signs of strain. And yet, no one could have predicted the tragedy that would soon follow, a tragedy that would shatter not only their gilded lives but also the image of perfection they had so carefully cultivated. It seemed, at first, as though the struggles with infertility had brought them closer. Sarah often confided in Rebecca Henderson, her closest friend, about James's unwavering support. "He's been incredible," Sarah had said once over a quiet lunch at Zuma. "No pressure, no blame, just optimism." He keeps reminding me that this is only a chapter, not the whole story. And for a time, it seemed James was right. They threw themselves into their lives with renewed vigor. Their property portfolio grew as rapidly as their social standing. Beyond their Emirates Hills mansion, they acquired a sleek penthouse overlooking Dubai Marina, a cozy yet extravagant ski chalet in the Swiss Alps, and a pied terre in London's coveted Mayfair. James's deep knowledge of international banking had given him an edge in navigating Dubai's surging real estate market, and their investments seemed to multiply effortlessly. To the outside world, the Mitchells' life was an empire of success, ambition, and love. But Sarah would later reflect on how the cracks first appeared, small, almost imperceptible, like the first faint tremors before an earthquake. James's business trips, always a regular part of his job, began to stretch longer. At first, Sarah dismissed the changes as a result of increased responsibilities at work. But soon, there were inconsistencies, subtle shifts in his behavior that pricked at the edges of her intuition. The man who had once called her every evening, no matter where he was in the world, now missed calls with flimsy excuses about poor internet connections. Yet his Instagram posts often showed him lounging in five-star hotels renowned for their exceptional Wi-Fi. Then came the financial discrepancies. At first, they seemed insignificant, unexplained restaurant charges on days James claimed to be in back-to-back meetings, hotel bookings in cities he hadn't mentioned. Sarah's sharp financial mind quickly flagged these irregularities, but she brushed them off. Corporate expenses, she told herself. Accounting errors. But the nagging feeling in her chest grew harder to ignore. James's explanations began to falter. He started changing passwords on their shared accounts, citing increased cybersecurity requirements at work. It's just protocol, he assured her with a dismissive wave. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had once shared every corner of his life with her was now guarding parts of it like a fortress. Friends noticed the changes, too. Michael Chan, a fellow banker and frequent guest at their legendary dinner parties, remarked, James was always so engaged. He used to be the guy cracking jokes, keeping everyone entertained. Lately, he'd show up late, leave early, or disappear midway through the evening to take calls. Their lavish gatherings, once a hallmark of their life, grew fewer and far between. And when they did host, James seemed distracted, often glued to his phone or pacing on the terrace while taking mysterious calls. Then there were the trips. Emergency board meetings, in London that Sarah later discovered hadn't been scheduled. Flights to Singapore that weren't logged on his corporate expense account. Documents related to their shared property investments, once meticulously maintained by both of them, began to vanish from their home office. It wasn't just the absences that unsettled Sarah, it was the growing sense of secrecy. There were phone calls that went silent the moment she answered, text messages that arrived at odd hours with cryptic explanations, and credit card purchases from luxury jewelry stores that yielded no gifts. By the end of 2023, Sarah was living in a state of quiet panic, her days consumed by a relentless analysis of James's every move. Every conversation felt like a game of chess, every gesture a potential clue. The man who had once been her rock, her partner in every sense of the word, was becoming a stranger. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to confront him. She wasn't ready to face the possibility that the life they had built, the life they had both sacrificed so much for, might be unraveling. Instead, she told herself she was imagining things. That James was just stressed. That the pressures of work and their struggles with infertility had taken a toll. But deep down, Sarah knew better. The signs were too glaring to ignore. And soon, the unanswered questions that haunted her would demand answers, answers she would find not in quiet conversations or heartfelt confessions but in the explosive, violent confrontation that was now hurtling toward them. The strange calls would soon be explained. The missing documents would reveal their sinister purpose. And the truth about James Mitchell's absences, the truth about the man she had shared her life with, would obliterate the foundations of everything Sarah thought she knew. And when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't just destroy their gilded life, it would leave blood on the marble floors of their perfect Dubai home. The words seemed to echo in Sarah's ears as she stared at the photographs spread across Hassan's desk. Her husband, her James, was living an entirely separate life. The child in his arms, the two small twins playing near his feet, and the serene expression on his face shattered the fragile illusion she had been clinging to. Hassan's voice was calm but edged with the professionalism of someone accustomed to delivering devastating truths. The twins appear to be about 3 years old. The woman who resides at the Olive Towers apartment has been identified as Amal Fahad, a former Emirates Airlines flight attendant. Records show she moved into the apartment about 4 years ago, and the lease is paid through an account registered under a corporate alias tied to your husband. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the photographs. The children, James's children, bore his unmistakable features, the same striking blue eyes, the same sharp jawline. But it wasn't just the faces that struck her, it was the tenderness in James's expression. The man who had grown increasingly distant and secretive at home looked at ease, even happy, in these images. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. He has another family, she whispered, more to herself than to Hassan. It appears so, Hassan confirmed, his tone measured. But that's not all we've uncovered. He slid another folder toward her. Inside were financial records, emails, and photographs. James had been funding this second household through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and investments, many of which Sarah had unknowingly helped him structure during their joint financial planning. Sarah's mind raced. The unexplained absences, the jewelry purchases, the secretive phone calls, it all made sense now. The evidence before her was irrefutable. But even as her world crumbled, a cold determination began to take root in her chest. "What else?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Hassan hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Amal isn't the only connection James has been keeping hidden. There are several communications between him and individuals linked to high-risk financial ventures, investments that, frankly, could be classified as illegal under both UAE and international law. It seems he's been laundering money through his position at HSBC, using his offshore accounts to hide the transactions." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. Not only had James betrayed her with another family, but he was also risking everything they had built together on dangerous financial schemes. The house, the cars, the lavish lifestyle, it was all tied to a web of deceit that could unravel at any moment. Hassan leaned forward, his voice softening. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask, do you want to proceed with this investigation? What we've uncovered so far is significant, but it may only be the tip of the iceberg. The deeper we dig, the more dangerous it could become." Dangerous. The word lingered in her mind. James wasn't just hiding affairs and children, he was entangled in something much larger, something that could have severe consequences for them both. "Yes," she said firmly, her jaw tightening. "I need to know everything." Over the following weeks, Hassan's team uncovered more details that painted a chilling picture of James Mitchell's double life. Not only was he funneling money through illegal channels, but he was also deeply involved with individuals tied to organized crime syndicates in Europe and Asia. These weren't just risky business deals, they were partnerships with men who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their operations. For Sarah, the revelations were both horrifying and liberating. She was no longer the naive wife trying to save her marriage, she was a woman armed with knowledge, preparing for a battle she hadn't anticipated. But James remained oblivious to her growing awareness. At home, he continued his charade of normalcy, though his demeanor remained distant. Sarah, however, played her part flawlessly. She smiled at their rare dinners, posted carefully curated photos on Instagram, and pretended to believe his increasingly implausible excuses. Then, one evening, she decided to confront him, not directly, but through a subtle test. She casually mentioned a fictional friend's experience with infidelity during a dinner conversation. James barely reacted, offering a non-committal comment before changing the subject. His indifference only fueled her resolve. Love captivating stories like this one? Don't miss out on more thrilling content. Hit the subscribe button now and stay updated with the most engaging narratives, twists, and turns. Like, share, and join the conversation below. Your next favorite story is just a click away. As 2024 began, Sarah found herself standing on the precipice of a decision that would change her life forever. She could expose James, his lies, his crimes, his secret family, or she could protect herself and quietly plan her escape from the house of cards they had built together. But fate had other plans. One night, as James worked late in his home office, Sarah noticed something unusual. His laptop, always guarded with paranoia, had been left unlocked. Her heart pounded as she approached, her fingers trembling as she navigated through his files. What she found chilled her to the bone: emails outlining financial transfers to accounts tied to dangerous individuals, photos of himself with Amal and their children in exotic locations, and detailed plans for a new property purchase, a purchase that didn't include her name. The final blow came in the form of a draft email, unsent, but devastatingly clear in its intent. It was addressed to a lawyer and detailed plans for a divorce. James had been preparing to leave her, on his terms, at his convenience, and likely without leaving her a penny. The realization was like a thunderclap. He had not only betrayed her heart but also intended to strip her of everything she had worked for. And that's when Sarah made her decision. She would not be a victim. What followed was a series of choices that would lead to a bloody confrontation, a night that would forever stain the marble floors of their Emirates Hills mansion. But Sarah was no longer the woman she had been when she walked into Hassan's office. She was something else now, a woman determined to reclaim her power, no matter the cost. The stark contrast between the life James lived with Sarah and the life he shared with Amara was a cruel revelation, cutting Sarah deeper than any betrayal she could have imagined. The polished, driven banker she had married, a man who had once seemed to be her perfect partner, had been living a double life so elaborate and deeply rooted that it felt as though her entire marriage had been a performance. The photographs from Amara's private social media painted a picture of a man Sarah hardly recognized. There was James, beaming in traditional Emirati attire, holding court at lavish family gatherings, looking every bit the devoted husband and father. In one photo, he stood beside Amara at a charity gala, his hand resting protectively on her back. In another, he crouched by the edge of a swimming pool, laughing as he helped Zara and Yasmin float in the water. The most recent post showed him cradling baby Sophia in the hospital, his face alight with joy and pride, a face Sarah hadn't seen in years. The discovery of the marriage certificate was the final, crushing blow. James hadn't just hidden Amara and their children, he had legally married her, converted to Islam, and built an entire second life that was as legitimate as the one he shared with Sarah. This wasn't a fleeting affair, it was a deliberate, calculated betrayal that spanned nearly half a decade. Sarah stared at the certificate for what felt like hours, the official seals and notarized signatures blurring together. She could feel her chest tightening, her breath catching as if the air itself had been taken from her. Her world, once so orderly and secure, was now crumbling beneath her. Hassan, ever the professional, gave her space to process the enormity of what she had just learned. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently, breaking the heavy silence, "there's more to consider. Amara's family is deeply connected. Any action you take will have significant repercussions, not just for James, but for you as well." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red but resolute. "I don't care about the consequences," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and grief. "He didn't just betray me. He built his success on lies, on us. And I want him to pay for it." Hassan nodded, his expression serious. "If you want to confront him, you need to be prepared for how he might react. A man like James doesn't orchestrate something like this without contingencies. He's thought this through." Sarah's mind raced. James's meticulous planning suddenly seemed sinister, each decision a deliberate step toward ensuring that he held all the power. But Sarah was determined to take that power back. Over the following days, Sarah worked with Hassan's team to gather evidence. Bank statements, property deeds, photos, and the marriage certificate, all meticulously compiled into a damning dossier. But it wasn't just about exposing James. Sarah wanted to protect herself. She had to be strategic, to think several moves ahead, just as James had. She began to quietly prepare. She opened new bank accounts in her name only, transferred funds, and consulted discreetly with a high-powered divorce lawyer who specialized in expatriate cases. Every move was calculated to ensure she could walk away from the marriage with her assets intact, and James's secrets exposed. But as she planned her escape, James's behavior at home grew increasingly erratic. He seemed to sense that something had shifted. He questioned her more often about her day, checked her phone when he thought she wasn't looking, and began coming home earlier than usual. His charm, once effortless, now felt forced. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, Sarah couldn't help but study him. His face, once so familiar, now seemed like a mask. She wondered how much of the man she had fallen in love with had ever been real. "Everything okay?" James asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Of course," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, but the tension in the room was palpable. The confrontation came sooner than Sarah had anticipated. One evening, while James was in his home office, she found herself standing outside the door, the dossier clutched in her hands. Her heart pounded as she knocked lightly and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. James looked up, startled. "Sarah? What's wrong?" She placed the folder on his desk, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "We need to talk." His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her. "What's this?" "Everything," she said simply. "Everything you've been hiding from me." James's face darkened as he opened the folder, flipping through the documents and photographs. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at her, his jaw tight. "You had me followed," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I had no choice," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "You lied to me, James. About everything. About Amara, about the children, about your entire life." James stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand," he began, but Sarah cut him off. "No, you don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You didn't just betray me, you built an entire second life while making me believe we were building one together. You've stolen years from me, James. Years." His face twisted in anger. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice cold. "You think this was easy? Balancing everything? Keeping everyone happy? Happy?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Do I look happy to you?" The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the house. Years of lies, resentment, and betrayal boiled over into a confrontation neither of them could control. And as the tension reached its breaking point, Sarah realized that the man standing before her wasn't the James she had married. Love captivating stories like this one? Don't miss out on more thrilling content. Hit the subscribe button now and stay updated with the most engaging narratives, twists, and turns. Like, share, and join the conversation below. Your next favorite story is just a click away. He was a stranger. And in the days to come, that realization would lead to a series of events that would end with blood on the marble floors of Villa 42. Simple indiscretions or even elaborate deceptions, they were the hallmarks of a man leading a life steeped in crime. Each revelation chipped away at the remnants of Sarah's trust, turning her heartbreak into a simmering fury. James wasn't just a liar, he was a criminal mastermind, using his charm and intelligence to manipulate everyone around him. The hidden passports raised questions Sarah was too terrified to ask. Who was James Mitchell? Was he even the man she thought she had married? Or was he someone else entirely, a man who had weaponized his dual identity to operate in shadows and leave no trace? As Hassan's team continued to uncover more layers of James's deceit, Sarah realized that this was no longer just a matter of personal betrayal. James's schemes threatened to entangle her legally, financially, and socially. Their joint accounts, their shared assets, and even her professional reputation were now liabilities. She had unknowingly signed off on documents, co-owned properties, and mingled funds that might implicate her in his criminal activities. The discovery of fraudulent client accounts tied to her name sent Sarah into a spiral of panic. Had James forged her signature? Had he used her pristine reputation in finance to shield his activities? The stakes had grown far beyond a shattered marriage. Sarah was at risk of losing everything, including her freedom. The confrontation that followed their initial argument was colder, more calculated. Armed with undeniable evidence, Sarah confronted James one evening after dinner. She waited until he had poured himself a glass of scotch and settled into his usual spot in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "I know about Amara," she began, her voice steady but low. James froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "Don't insult me," Sarah snapped, tossing a thick envelope onto the coffee table. The dossier Hassan had prepared spilled out, photographs, bank statements, marriage certificates. "I know everything. Amara, the children, the offshore accounts. Everything." James's face hardened as he set his glass down. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes scanning the evidence. "You've been digging into my life," he said finally, his voice calm but ice-cold. "That was a mistake." "No, James," Sarah countered, her voice rising. "The mistake was thinking you could get away with this. You've lied to me for years. You've used me, used our marriage, to cover for your crimes." James stood, his presence suddenly menacing. "You don't understand what you're getting into, Sarah. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy? You've barely scratched the surface. What is this, then?" Sarah shot back, pointing at the evidence. "A game? A power trip? Were you ever even my husband, or was I just another pawn in your schemes?" His silence was answer enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and silent warfare. James didn't deny Sarah's accusations, but he didn't apologize either. Instead, he began asserting control in subtle, chilling ways. Her access to their shared accounts was suddenly restricted. Friends began calling less frequently, clearly wary after private conversations with James. Even Hassan's team reported being followed, a sign that James was aware of their involvement. Sarah began to fear for her safety. James was not a man who tolerated challenges to his authority, and now she had become his greatest threat. Her once palatial home felt like a gilded prison, every corner hiding a camera or listening device she suspected James had installed. Desperate, Sarah decided to take her evidence to the authorities. But as she prepared to make her move, a new complication emerged. Hassan's investigation uncovered links between James and powerful figures in Dubai's business and political spheres. Several of his fraudulent schemes had involved high-ranking officials, and exposing James could have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for Sarah as well. Hassan warned her that taking legal action could backfire. "People like James don't operate alone," he said. "If you take him down, you'll be taking others down with him. And they won't go quietly." As Sarah wrestled with her next steps, the tension in Villa 42 reached a boiling point. James became increasingly erratic, his calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. One night, after a particularly heated argument, he grabbed her wrist tightly enough to leave bruises. "That's enough, Sarah," he hissed. "You think you can ruin me? Think again." It was the first time Sarah felt genuine fear for her life. She knew then that James was capable of anything. The night of the bloody confrontation began like any other. James had been drinking more heavily, pacing the living room while Sarah watched from the kitchen. The weight of her decision pressed on her. Should she run, report him, or confront him one final time? As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah realized she couldn't wait any longer. She retrieved a hidden flash drive containing all the evidence she had compiled, tucked it into her purse, and steeled herself. But James was already ahead of her. As she turned to leave the house, he appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. What happened next would forever change Sarah's life. A struggle ensued, accusations flying like daggers. The confrontation spiraled out of control, ending with a sickening thud as James fell to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The headlines the next morning were as sensational as Sarah had feared: British expatriate wife kills banking executive husband in Dubai mansion. But the story that would unfold in the weeks to come would reveal a tale of deception, betrayal, and survival more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The events of that night remain a tangled web of emotion, fury, and calculated action, shrouded in mystery, even as they were later dissected in courtrooms and the media. Sarah waited in the dimly lit office, her breath shallow and her heart pounding as she clutched the flash drive containing the damning evidence against James. She had planned to leave that night, to escape the oppressive walls of their mansion and take her case to the authorities. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, she heard the distinct sound of James's car pulling into the driveway. Her mind raced. Confront him. Flee. Hide the evidence and act as though nothing had changed. The weight of every betrayal, every humiliation, pressed down on her, and her hand brushed against the letter opener lying on the desk, a small, sharp object that seemed almost insignificant in the moment. James entered the house with his usual air of superiority, oblivious to the storm brewing inside. As he made his way to the bar to pour himself another drink, Sarah emerged from the office. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with exhaustion and rage. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. James glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Is this about your little detective game again?" he asked with a mocking smile. "I thought we were done with the theatrics." Sarah stepped closer, holding a stack of documents in her hand, the marriage certificate, the photos, the bank statements. She slammed them onto the table, causing James to flinch slightly. "No more lies, James. No more excuses. I know everything. Amara. The children. The offshore accounts. The fraud. All of it." James's expression darkened, the smugness evaporating. He picked up the documents, flipping through them with an air of indifference. "You've been busy," he muttered, tossing the papers back onto the table. "I'll give you credit for that. But you don't understand what you're playing with, Sarah. This isn't some game." "No," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's not a game. It's my life. My marriage. My reputation. You've stolen everything from me, James. Everything." He smirked, leaning back against the counter. "Your life. Your reputation. Don't be so dramatic, Sarah. You've had everything you wanted: money, status, a perfect home. What more could you possibly need?" "I needed a husband who didn't live a double life," she shot back, her voice breaking. "I needed honesty. Loyalty. Not this." She gestured at the pile of evidence between them. James stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His voice was cold, almost menacing. "You don't get to play the victim here, Sarah. You think you're innocent. You've enjoyed the benefits of my hard work, my sacrifices. You wouldn't last a day without me." The words were a spark to the tinder of Sarah's rage. Years of silent suffering, of questioning herself, of being gaslit and manipulated erupted in a moment of pure, unfiltered fury. The struggle that ensued was chaotic, visceral, and tragic. In her anger, Sarah grabbed the letter opener from the desk. She hadn't intended to use it, not really. It was meant to be a threat, a desperate attempt to make him see the gravity of his actions. But James, seeing the object in her hand, lunged at her, his face twisted in anger. "You're out of your mind," he snarled, grabbing her wrist. The scuffle was brief but brutal. In the chaos, Sarah felt the blade connect with something solid. James staggered back, his eyes wide with shock as he looked down at the blood spreading across his crisp white shirt. For a moment, there was only silence. James stumbled, crashing to the floor. Sarah dropped the letter opener, her hands trembling as she stared at what she'd done. The man who had controlled her life, manipulated her, betrayed her, now lay motionless on the marble floor of their perfect home. When the police arrived hours later, responding to Sarah's frantic call, they found her sitting in the living room, her designer nightgown stained with blood, her hands folded in her lap. The evidence of James's betrayal was scattered across the office, but it was Sarah who became the focus of their investigation. The headlines the next morning were sensational: British expat wife kills banking executive husband in Dubai mansion. The media frenzy that followed turned Sarah into a household name, her story dissected on talk shows and news outlets around the world. But as investigators began to unravel the layers of James's life, his crimes, his second family, his financial schemes, it became clear that this was no ordinary domestic tragedy. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with Sarah's defense team painting her as a woman driven to the edge by years of deceit and manipulation. The prosecution, however, argued that her actions were premeditated, citing her meticulous collection of evidence and the emotional intensity of her final confrontation with James. In the end, the story of Sarah Mitchell and James Mitchell became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how even the most perfect lives can unravel in the most spectacular and devastating ways. February 15, 2024. The day began with an air of tranquility in Emirates Hills, a community known for its silence interrupted only by the occasional hum of luxury cars. Behind the marble facade of Villa 42, however, a storm was brewing, one that would leave a trail of destruction across continents. The morning routines of the Mitchells seemed ordinary. Security cameras recorded Sarah Mitchell leaving at 7:15 a.m., as she did every workday. Her impeccable appearance, designer blazer, tailored trousers, and the signature Cartier bracelet she always wore, hinted at nothing unusual. 30 minutes later, James Mitchell departed, dressed sharply for a day of meetings, his car moving smoothly through the quiet streets. What the cameras didn't show was Sarah's detour. Instead of heading to her office at Goldman Sachs, she parked her car in the Festival City Mall's garage. From there, she hailed a taxi, directing the driver back to Emirates Hills. Arriving through the service entrance at Villa 42, Sarah avoided the prying eyes of cameras and neighbors alike. The household staff, usually bustling in the villa, had been dismissed the previous evening. Sarah had insisted they take the day off, citing a need for privacy in some minor renovations. It was a seemingly trivial decision, but one that investigators would later scrutinize. Alone in the cavernous mansion, Sarah moved with quiet efficiency. She spent hours in James's home office, combing through files, copying documents, and organizing the evidence she had painstakingly gathered over months. Every piece was a brick in the fortress of deceit James had built around her life. She packed the incriminating files into a leather briefcase, ensuring duplicates were stored on encrypted drives she'd hidden in safety deposit boxes across the city. On the kitchen counter, she placed her phone and wedding ring. Beside them, a handwritten note addressed to James. It was short but hauntingly direct: "You destroyed everything. Now, it's your turn to face the truth." James arrived home earlier than expected, around 6:30 p.m. The house was unusually quiet, its vast spaces filled with an unsettling stillness. Calling out for Sarah, he received no answer. As he walked into the living room, his eyes fell on the briefcase sitting on the coffee table. Sarah emerged from the shadows of the office, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but cold. "What is this, Sarah?" James asked, gesturing toward the briefcase. "It's everything," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. "Everything you've hidden from me. Every lie you've told. Amara. The children. The money. The fraud." James's face darkened as he realized what she meant. "You had me followed," he said, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "I didn't need to," Sarah retorted, her composure cracking. "Your arrogance left a trail even a child could follow. You thought you could get away with it all, didn't you?" He laughed bitterly, his tone laced with mockery. "And what now, Sarah? You think you can ruin me? Take me down. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her voice rose, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. "Who I'm dealing with? I'm dealing with a man who lied to my face for years. Who built an entire second life while I waited at home, hoping for a child you gave to someone else." James stepped closer, his demeanor shifting to one of icy calm. "You're making a mistake. You don't know what you're playing with." The argument escalated, voices echoing through the empty villa. Sarah's carefully planned confrontation spiraled into chaos. James, sensing her growing desperation, tried to grab the briefcase, but she pulled it away. In the struggle, James grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. "You've always been dramatic, Sarah. Always needing to be the victim. Let me guess, you're going to the police? To the media? Do you think they'll believe you?" Her fury boiled over. Grabbing the nearest object, a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk, she swung it wildly. The blow connected with James's temple, sending him staggering backward. Blood began to drip down his face as he steadied himself against the desk. "Are you insane?" he hissed, lunging toward her. What happened next was a blur, a mixture of rage and fear that neither would fully comprehend. A struggle ensued, violent and desperate. Sarah grabbed the letter opener from the desk, wielding it defensively. "Stay back, James," she screamed. But he didn't stop. In the heat of the moment, as James grabbed for her arm, the blade struck. He staggered, clutching his side, his expression shifting from anger to shock. James collapsed onto the marble floor, the silence that followed deafening. Sarah stood frozen, the letter opener still in her trembling hand, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. When the police arrived later that evening, summoned by Sarah herself, they found her sitting on the living room floor, staring blankly ahead. The once pristine villa was now a crime scene, its polished surfaces stained with blood. The next day, the world awoke to sensational headlines: "Murder in the Hills, British expat wife kills banking tycoon husband." "Scandal in Dubai, a double life exposed in blood." As the story unfolded, revelations about James's secret life and criminal activities gripped the public. Sarah became both a figure of sympathy and vilification, painted as either a victim driven to the edge or a calculating killer who had finally snapped. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile cases Dubai had ever seen, with Sarah's every move scrutinized by the media. Witnesses testified about James's duplicity, his criminal enterprises, and his manipulation. But the prosecution painted Sarah as a woman consumed by jealousy and rage, unable to accept her husband's betrayals. Love captivating stories like this one? Don't miss out on more thrilling content. Hit the subscribe button now and stay updated with the most engaging narratives, twists, and turns. Like, share, and join the conversation below. Your next favorite story is just a click away.